everybody, welcome to another off-the-shelf board game review. This week we're going to be looking at Cthulhu Wars, a very high quality, very well produced area control game for 2 to 4 players that will play up to 7 if you buy the expansions. It takes about 45 to 90 minutes and it's based on the writings of H.P. Lovecraft. In Cthulhu Wars, the end has come, the Ancient Ones have awoken, and they seek nothing but to bring doom and ruin to planet Earth. Each player is going to control one of the factions from the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, and your eventual objective is to be the first one to bring doom and complete annihilation to what is left of planet Earth. It's not all terrible, though. At least each faction has great benefits to all their members because they're going to continue to pay you, at least until you're dead. At its heart, though, Cthulhu Wars is an area control crossbred with a war-style game where each player has asymmetrical powers and they're facing off, and again, the eventual objective is to be the grand winner, and to win this game, you have to bring the most doom and ruin to planet Earth. Every single turn, players are going to get power based on however many cultists they happen to have on the world map. They're going to get power based on having the ability to actually control some of the portals that lead to the other world where the great old ones come from. And they're also going to get power based on gates that just happen to be open that aren't controlled, or very rarely they're going to get power based on special abilities they've learned through playing the game. Power is used to do things such as adding more gates to the game board, summoning more creatures in your faction to help attack your enemies and try to bring ruin and destruction to your opponents. It's also used to move your creatures across the land, destroy your opponents, and also take over their gates, helping you to win the game. The gates themselves are actually the key to winning the game because every single turn, at the start of every single round after all the players gain their power for that turn, they're also going to gain victory points along the doom track based on however many portals or gates to the other world they currently control with their cultists. Control the gates, control the game. Fail to control the gates, and you're going to lose. Adding to the fun and the replay value of the game is the asymmetric powers between each of the opponents, the factions playing the game, based on unique spell books, which are unique to every single faction. Gives you special abilities that are unique only to you that are going to help you conquer your opponents. Unique creatures based on the writings of H.P. Lovecraft that have various strengths, various powers, and various abilities that help bring ruin to your opponents. And of course, let's not forget the great old ones themselves who like nothing more than to relish in the destruction of their opponents. Combat and gameplay is very, very quick and simple thanks to very simple dice mechanics for the combat phases. And also the fact that players don't all get to take their actions at once. Players are going to take turns spending a little bit of power doing one action, then passing the next player. And they're going to continue to go around until everybody's completely burned up all their power. Part of the strategy is using your power at the correct times, using your power wisely, and not overburning your power and leaving yourself a sitting duck for your opponents to come back in, destroy you, and take back what you have taken from them. In Cthulhu Wars, victory goes to the first faction who can find all 6 of their spellbooks, bring the doom track up to level 30 or more, and bring ruination to the earth. Before I show you how to play Cthulhu Wars, there's a couple of quick concepts that you really need to understand. First and most importantly is this is a very asymmetrical game, which means every single faction that comes in the base set, and there are 4 factions in the base set, plus at least 3 more factions that are coming down the pipe sometime later in 2015. Plus there's also the neutral factions, so this game is going to be changing quite a bit as it develops over the rest of 2015. My point is, though, since this is an asymmetrical game, that means that every single faction is going to play differently. And not only that, that also means that every single faction is going to break the rules. So if I tell you how to play the game, and if you look at one of the factions and it tells you to do something else, do what the faction board says because it's a faction that happens to be breaking one of the rules. A really good example is, in the game, in the basic rules, basically only cultists will ever give you power in the game. On top of that, if you ever happen to have any gates on the board, if they're not controlled by anybody, they're going to give some power. And if they happen to be controlled by somebody, they're going to give that player even more power. And that's a pretty basic rule for the game. Yet there's factions that break those rules. For example, the Black Goat faction with the right spellbooks can actually get power from the game board by having their Dark Young in play. Again, you have to get a special ability to gain this power, but you've already broken the base rules for the game. Also, in the rules, it does state that the Great Old One will never give you power except if you happen to be Cthulhu and you happen to also get the right spellbook. And there happens to be more gates in play that happen to be on water spaces, then you're also going to get power as long as Cthulhu is in play. So again, he's also breaking the rules. My point with all this, though, is just basically to say that while I'm going to teach you how to play Cthulhu Wars, I'm also going to interject sometimes with exceptions and understand that's just because some factions break the rules. And one other point, since this is going to be a tutorial video, and while obviously this game is a love letter to fans of H.P. Lovecraft and also fans of board gaming, this is also a really good game. Not to jump ahead and get into my review already, but it's a really good game that I think other people can enjoy even if they're not fans of H.P. Lovecraft or his writings or the mythos. And there are people out there who don't enjoy it. So to keep things simple, I'm going to try to avoid using the names too much and avoid confusion. So I'll probably just refer to Cthulhu as Green's Great Old One. Occasionally, again, I'm going to do this to make things simple for other people. I'll refer to Nyarlathotep as Blue's Great Old One, or maybe occasionally I'll call him by his name, but I'm going to try to avoid doing that to avoid confusion. Of course, I might occasionally refer to the Black Goat's Great Old One as Shubby, just because she's cute and she's kind of adorable, like a Shubby. One other very important thing to also understand about Cthulhu Wars is this game is designed for 3 to 5 players, although you can also play with 2 players if you want to use some rules, which I'm not a very big fan of, so I'm not going to teach you how to play with the 2-player game. Because personally, I wasn't impressed with those 2-player rules at all. But this game comes with a double-sided game board, and it's 2 parts of the game board, and you're going to set this game board up depending on however many players you happen to have playing Cthulhu Wars. So if you happen to have a 3-player game, you're going to set the game up as a 3-player board, and you look down here in the lower right for the 3-player board there also. If you have 4 players, you need to pick one of these boards and flip it over. Now they suggest that you pick the right-hand board and flip it over to this 5-player side. You can actually do either board if you want, but for your first couple of learning games, you want to turn the right side board to the 5-player side, leave the left side board as the 3-player side, and that's how you're going to set it up for a 4-player game. Now once the factions get released for the game and you can start playing the game with 5 players, 6 players, 7 players, or supposedly even 8 players is eventually going to be in the plans, you're going to have to flip this board over to the double-sided 5-player board for 5-player faction, and when you play with 6, 7, or 8 players, you need to get the extra game boards that come out there that allow you to have that many players in the game. But since this base game only comes with 4 factions, that means you can only have up to 4 players in the game. So we're going to have one board flipped over to the 3-player side, and we're going to have one player board played over or flipped over to the 5-player side. 5 players listed lower right, 3 players listed upper left. That's the setup for a 4-player game. There is also no player elimination in Cthulhu Wars. Players are actually racing to see who can get the highest Doom track first, or bring about the ritual of annihilation first, and that is actually how the game ends. And yes, that does mean that you can be fighting all over this game board. Your Great Old Ones can be defeated multiple times. Your creatures can be defeated multiple times. They can be destroyed, brought back in multiple times. You can even be completely wiped off the board down to your last creature belonging to your faction. And on your next turn, you can still come right back into the game, start building up your forces all over again. The way this game is going to end is one of 2 ways. If a player manages to move their faction marker all the way to the Game Over 30 track part of the Doom track, or if they happen to bring their faction marker beyond that point, or if a player happens to launch the final Ritual of Annihilation, that will be the final turn for the game. Everybody's going to get to complete that final round, but that is the final round of the game as soon as somebody passes the 30 mark, or as soon as somebody initiates the Ritual of Annihilation for the final time. And if you ever forget, it's pretty plainly marked on the board. It says right over here, Game Over at the 30 mark, and it says instant death on the Annihilation track, so it should be pretty obvious at that point. If anything gets to that mark or that mark, it is Game Over. You're going to figure out who the winner is, and the winner is going to be the person who happens to be the furthest along the Doom track, even if the Ritual of Annihilation ended the game. It's whoever is furthest along the Doom track, as long as that player has also recovered all 6 of their spell books. That's the other victory condition requirement for the game. So the objective of the game is to be the first person to find all 6 of your spell books, and each faction has exactly 6 spell books, and then also be the highest on the Doom track when the game ends. Whoever can do so wins. To play Cthulhu Wars, everybody obviously is going to need to start with a faction. There's a couple different ways you can pick your factions. You can go to blows and take somebody down to the ground. Last man standing gets to pick their faction. Or you can do it the civil way and just simply flip over one of these tokens. Whichever token you happen to flip over is going to be the faction that you're going to be playing for that game of Cthulhu Wars. Once you've chosen your faction, you're going to get all 6 spellbooks that match your faction, and these are all color matching, so Cthulhu gets green. And also happens to get all the green figures that are going to be for their faction and their monsters, their Great Old One, their cultists, and their faction's ritual marker. One will be used to track their power, and one will be used to track exactly where on the Doom track their score currently lies. Once each player has picked out their faction, they're going to take all the miniatures for their faction board, all 6 of their spellbooks, and any extra things that may be unique to their faction, such as the King in Yellow's faction, which also gets desecration tokens on top of everything else they get for their starting faction. Players are also going to place their ritual marker on the 0 space of the Doom track, and they're also going to put their other ritual marker on the 0 space of their power track, and I'll explain the power track in just a few moments. The one thing I just want to point out here is that everything that you start off with your faction is a very limited resource, so that does mean that you only have 6 cultists for the entire game. If somehow you find a way to get more cultists on the board, too bad. The most you can ever have is 6 on the game board at any time. You only get 1 Cthulhu. You don't get to summon more of them because you only have 1 figure, which means you're limited to what you got. Same thing also goes for the deep ones, the 2 Shoggoths, and the 2 Starspawn. Limited resources. You can never have more than what the game supplies on the game board at any time. Every single faction board is going to break down exactly the special abilities and the powers of every single faction. And again, since they're all asymmetrical, none of them are going to match perfectly, but they're going to have some general things that are very similar between each and every faction. For example, every single faction gets 6 spellbooks and 6 things that are required before you can attain those spellbooks. Once you do whatever the single requirement is for each one of those spellbooks, you can pick any one of your remaining spellbooks that you have not gained yet, add them to your faction board, and you now have that permanent power or ability that faction spellbook has given you for the rest of the game. So if you happen to manage to get 3 abilities or requirements met, you can get 3 spellbooks. And the really cool thing is anytime you meet one of the requirements for the spellbook, for example, this one says that Awaken Cthulhu. As soon as you awaken Cthulhu for the very first time when you're playing the game, you get to pick any spellbook you have not gained yet, add it to your faction board, and it's now a permanent ability you have for the rest of the game. It's one of the really cool things I really like about Cthulhu Wars is the fact that you can tailor your strategy to what your opponents are doing by picking different spellbooks at different times, because the game does not force you to pick which spellbook you want to pick. It just tells you what your minimum requirements are to be able to pick one of your remaining spellbooks to add to your faction board. Each faction board is also going to have a power track, and this is going to be used to track exactly how much power you have remaining. Every time you gain power, you're going to move up along the power board. Every time you use power, based on how much power you're going to use, you're going to go down on the power board. Now, the power board does max out at 20, but your power does not. So if you happen to go past 20, you can either use some kind of coin or marker to remind you that you've gone past 20, or you can simply wrap around and remember that once you get back to 0, you're back up at 20 actually, just because on this turn you managed to get past 20 power. And it is possible to do. You're not going to do it all the time, but towards the later half of the game, it will be very possible to get more than 20 power on your turn. Every single faction board is also going to have a place where you can place your captured cultists before they're sacrificed. Every single faction board is going to come with a very unique power, which is unique to your faction only. Only you can use that power, and again, every one of these 4 factions and the rest of the factions still to come in the game have different powers, very unique to their own special faction. Each faction board is also going to list the units that you have available to you, and everything that you control is a unit. Your Great Old One is a unit, your monsters are units, and even your cultists are considered units. But they all have different abilities and different costs to bring them into play. For example, it says that this is the cost to bring this unit into play. This is how many combat dice that unit gets to roll whenever it's in combat. So cultist costs 1, and there's a silhouette if you can't tell exactly which one or if you don't know the names of these creatures. So a deep one looks like a frog. There's your little frog guy. Your Shoggoth looks like this shambling, whatever you want to call it, and there's a silhouette of a Shoggoth. Your Starspawn miniature, and of course you can't miss Cthulhu, the giant silhouette right there. Each one of these faction boards is going to list how much it costs to bring that creature, one of those creatures, into play. So to bring one deep one into play is going to cost you 1 power. He's going to have 1 combat die, For your Shoggoth, each one of your Shoggoths to bring one into play is going to cost you 2 power, give you 2 combat dice when they're in play. Each one of your Star Spawn is going to cost 3 power, give you 3 power, or 3 combat dice. And of course, finally, Cthulhu is going to cost you 10 power to bring into play the first time. And he has a special ability which makes him less costly to bring into play each additional time. And every time he's in battle, he's going to roll 6 combat dice. Finally, every single faction board is going to list exactly what you need to do to bring your Great Old One into play. It's not just as simple as spending power. Each one of the Great Old Ones has a specific requirement that you must meet. If you can't meet that requirement, you can't bring that Great Old One into play, even if you happen to have enough power. Your Great Old One is also going to give you a very special power that only works when that Great Old One is in play. And again, that's going to be very unique to your Great Old One and your faction, or in the case of the King in Yellow, who happens to come with 2 Great Old Ones, which is unique to the base box, as he is the only faction that comes with 2 Great Old Ones in the base set. And there is a hierarchy of your units. It's very, very important, especially for when you're capturing. I'll explain that when we get to that point, but cultists are at the bottom, monsters are above cultists, and Great Old Ones are above monsters. Very important hierarchy. I'll explain to you exactly how it works when we get to the point of explaining how to capture your enemy's cultists, which is something you want to do because every time you capture one of their cultists, you can sacrifice them for more power. One thing I want to add before I forget is that the game board, when it comes to the game board itself, every single space in the game is pretty much equal except for the case of special abilities. That means that land spaces and water spaces are identical 100%, again, except for special abilities such as Cthulhu. He has special extra benefits when he's underwater or when he's on water spaces, and he can do extra special things that he can't do when he's on land spaces. And that also means that water spaces can have portals built on them, just like land spaces can. Water spaces can also be desecrated by the King in Yellow just as long or as well as land spaces can also be desecrated by the King in Yellow. It also means that cultists can move onto water spaces just like they can move onto land spaces with no restrictions. And they can also control portals on water spaces just like they can control portals on land spaces. Just one point I want to get across that very, very important to the game, that land spaces and water spaces, there's really no difference between them except for special abilities such as what Cthulhu brings when it comes to water spaces, and that's unique to Cthulhu himself. Once each player has picked their chosen faction and they're ready to start playing, everybody's going to set up the game based on exactly which faction they have, and they're all going to start in the exact same location based on their faction. So the blue player is always going to start with their faction right here in this territory. Red faction will start here. Yellow will always start in this space, and green Cthulhu will always start in that space. And everybody's going to start with 1 portal in their starting area with one of their 6 cultists on top of that portal, showing that they control that space at the very start of the game. And of course, if you ever forget that, it's listed on every one of the faction boards. Every single player starts with 6 cultists. It's the same for every one of the factions. Every player's cultists are exactly the same at the start of the game. And I say at the start of the game because the red faction can actually get an ability to improve the power of their cultists, which is unique to their faction. Cthulhu Wars itself is actually pretty easy to understand once you learn how to play the game. It's pretty quick. The game is played over 4 phases. The very first phase is where the players are going to get the power based on however many cultists they have on the board, how many gates are on the board, and how many of those gates they actually control, which doesn't give them additional power. You're just going to do a little bit of quick math, figure it out, and you're going to get that amount of power at the start of every single turn. Once that's done, the player who has the most power out of all the players, so if one player happens to have 17 power, another one has 16 power, and everybody else has 10 or less, the person with the 17 power is going to be player 1, except for the very, very first round of the game, because at the first round of the game, every single person is going to start with 9 power based on the cultists and the gates they control on the board at the start of the game, because everybody's going to start exactly the same as I got it set up on the board right now. So the very first round and the very first round only, Cthulhu is always the first player because green's best. The really unique thing to Cthulhu Wars when it comes to the turn order is that when you become the first player, you're actually going to take the turn order circle and you're going to decide exactly in which order the play is going to occur. So there's a clockwise and there is a counterclockwise way to flip this disc. If you're the first player, you get to decide who the second, third, and fourth player goes, whether it's going to be clockwise or counterclockwise. You just decide which side is going to face up. If you want the game to continue clockwise for this turn, And this turn only, put the disc clockwise up. If you want the turn order to go counterclockwise, put it counterclockwise up. And again, the first player is the one who gets to make this decision. And this is also a very good time to start groveling towards the other players and hoping they're going to make the turn order go in your favor. Once you've figured out who the first player is going to be for the current round, you're going to move on to the Doom phase, where people are going to move up on the Doom track. They're also going to get the chance. It's an option. You don't have to do it, but you also get the chance to perform a ritual of annihilation. Now, the reasons why you may or may not want to do it, first of all, it costs you power to do it, and also it slowly moves you towards the end of the game. And if your Doom track is not moved up far enough, or you don't happen to have all 6 of your spell books, because remember, no matter how much you move on the Doom track at the end of the game, if you don't have all 6 of your spell books, you cannot win no matter what. So you may not necessarily want to bring around the Ritual of Annihilation, at least until you got all 6 of your spell books. Once you've moved up the Doom track, once you've decided if you do or do not want to perform the Ritual of Annihilation, once that's done, you're going to figure out if anybody at this point has won the game. And if anybody's won the game up to this point by being past the 30 point or beyond it, or if they manage to do the final ritual to end the game, that's going to be the final round. You're not going to even move on to the action phase. You're just going to figure out who the winner of the game is, and game over. The game is not ended at this point. You're going to move on to the action phase. And during the action phase, players are going to get the chance to build gates, summon more powerful creatures, move their creatures onto the board, possibly capture other cultists, and do other things to help bring around victory for their team. Once the action phase is over, that round is over, and you're going to start all over at the beginning of the game with everybody gaining power. Everybody's going to figure out who the first player is. You're going to do the Doom track, the Annihilation, check for victory, and then move back to the action phase. You're going to continue doing this until somebody wins the game. I'll go ahead and break down all the phases for you and show you exactly how Cthulhu Wars plays. So for the very first phase, the very first thing you need to do is everybody's going to gain power. This is going to happen at the very start of the game. And the way this is going to be calculated is every player is going to get 1 point of power for every cultist they have in play. And again, remember, this is an asymmetric game, so some of the factions gain extra special abilities by having some of their spellbooks in play. For example, the Black Goat faction can also gain power from their Dark Young, but again, that's a spellbook that you have to have in play, and if you don't have it in play, you don't get that special ability. So for the basic rules, every player is going to get 1 power for every single cultist they happen to have in play. So at the start of the game, every single player is going to start with exactly 6 power for every single faction, because every faction is going to start with 6 cultists in play. Next, every single player is also going to gain an additional 2 power for every single gate they control. Now, don't confuse yourself and try to jump the gun and just give yourself 3 power if you happen to have a cultist on a gate. And the reason why they don't do that is because, as I said earlier, some of the factions also have some monsters that also act like cultists to some certain extent, and if there's those special monsters and those special spellbooks happen to be in play, they can also get power that way. So, for example, if the red faction had their right spellbook in play and had the red sign spellbook in play, for example, since this spellbook is in play, now all their Dark Young are technically treated like cultists in the fact that they can start controlling gates. And that's a unique power to the red player, so don't get confused. You gain 1 power for every cultist you have in play, 2 power for every gate you control, whether it's controlled by a cultist, or you have the special power that allows you to control it with 1 of your Dark Young. Next, every single player is also going to gain 1 power for every uncontrolled gate that happens to be on the board. No matter how many uncontrolled gates happen to be on the board, if there's multiple uncontrolled gates and nobody controls those gates, every single player is going to get a little bit of benefit from having those gates out on the board at this time. So if this was a sample setup or this was a current game that we had going, every single player would have 8 power to start with for 6 for the cultists, plus 2 for the controlled gates, plus every player would also start with 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 power for every single player. This just happened to be the starting for the game. And just to shake things up a little bit, if this happened to be the current standings for the yellow player, they would get 1 point for their 1 cultist on the board. They get an additional 2 power for controlling a gate for a total of 3. Plus there's currently 5 uncontrolled gates on the board. This player would start with a total of 8 power at the start of the game, while all of the other 3 factions would start with a total of 13 power, putting them at 1 heck of a disadvantage at the start of this game. Once everybody's figured out all their power, the person who happens to have the least amount of power is going to get a little bit of a bonus to help pick them up so they don't fall too far behind the game. If you start a round with the least amount of power, you're going to compare your power versus the player currently in the current round who has the most power, and you're going to move your power track to move up to be half as much as they happen to have. So if we happen to have a game where the yellow sign happens to have 16 power, and Cthulhu, thanks to some very poor playing on the prior round, only happens to have 2 cultists currently on the board, doesn't happen to control any gates at all, and this gate happens to be controlled by another player, so they happen to have only 2 cultists on the board, they're only going to get 2 power, which would be pretty abysmal, especially compared to the yellow sign who happens to have all the way up to 16. So to help you out, anytime that you have less than half of whoever starts the round with the most, you're going to move up to get at least half of what they have. So, since yellow sign has 16, Cthulhu, even though it only has 2 cultists on the board, they're going to start this round with 8 power, which happens to be half of whoever has the most. And of course, you're going to round up, so this person happens to have 19 power. You're going to start the round with 10. Once everybody has figured out how much power they're going to have for the current round, you need to figure out who the starting player is. And again, on the very first round of the game is always Cthulhu. Unless Cthulhu is not in play, then you can go to a fist fight, or do it the old-fashioned way by just letting somebody decide to be the first player for that round. Once you figured out who the first player is going to be, you get to move on to the Doom phase, and this is where the players are going to start earning their victory points. During the Doom phase, every single player for every single gate they currently control, now they have to be controlling those gates, they're going to get to move up on the Doom track based on however many gates they control. So in this example, this was our current game board right here. The red player, the black goat player, who has 2 gates they control, so they're going to gain 2 power, or 2 movement on the Doom track, going from 2 all the way up to 4. The yellow player currently controls 1 gate, so they're going to go from 6 to 7. The blue player, or Crawling Chaos, currently controls 1 gate, so in this example they go from 25 to 26. And the green player, the Cthulhu player, controls 0 gates, so they're going to get 0 movement on the Doom track. Now, one important thing that I forgot to say earlier is the very first round of the game, you completely skip the Doom phase and you completely skip the Annihilation track phase. But that only occurs on the very first round of the game. After that, you always make sure you always have a Doom phase and everybody gets a chance to do a ritual of Annihilation. To perform the ritual of Annihilation, every single player is going to go in a round robin, and every player in turn order gets to decide if they want to or if they want to skip doing a ritual of Annihilation. Once you've made a decision, you can't change your mind based on what the other players are doing, and you're simply going to have the very first player decide if they do or do not want to do the ritual. If they decide to do it, they can go through the ritual. If they decide not to do it, it moves to the next player to do it. And any amount of players can perform the ritual on that turn. The trick is it gets much more expensive each time to do the ritual, and it also brings you that much closer to ending the game. To perform a ritual of Annihilation, you're simply going to spend an amount of power based on where the current track is on the ritual of Annihilation. You're going to spend the amount of power, and then you're going to get some more movement on the Doom track based on, again, however many gates you currently control. And on top of that, if you happen to have your Great Old One in play, you're also going to get an Elder Sign, or I should say they're actually broken Elder Signs. I'll get into the broken Elder Signs in just a moment. And one more point, you also get 1 broken Elder Sign for every Great Old One you happen to have in play. So the yellow player does have a little bit of an advantage because they actually come with 2 Great Old Ones in the base game, which means that if they do a Ritual of Annihilation, they're going to end up getting 2 broken Elder Signs versus everybody else who can get a max of only 1 broken Elder Sign for having their Great Old One in play when a Ritual of Annihilation is performed by that player. So going back to our example, if Cthulhu happens to be the first player, he currently controls 0 gates. Performing a Ritual of Annihilation will be pretty worthless for him because not only does the Cthulhu player or the green player not have any gates they control, their Great Old One is not in place, so it would be pretty worthless to perform the ritual unless they just want to make things more difficult for the other players, or for some reason they manage to jump very, very far on the ritual or the Doom track and they want to bring around the end of the game because that's part of their strategy. So you can do it, just happens to be in their case not really a good reason to do it. But if you do decide to do the ritual, you're going to spend the amount of power based on where the track currently is at. It goes anywhere from 5 all the way up to 10 power points. You spend the amount of power based on exactly where the track happens to be. And then you're going to gain more movement on the Doom track in addition to the free Doom track movement you just got a moment before. This is going to be in addition to that, and again, it's going to be based on however many gates you control. So if the yellow player, who currently controls one gate, did the Ritual of Annihilation on this turn, they'd gain one more movement on the Doom track, and since they also happen to have two of their Great Old Ones in play, they'd get to draw two random broken Elder Signs and add them to their pile, and these will be worth extra victory points at the end of the game. Now, the broken Elder Signs are one of the cool things about the game that adds an element of hidden scoring to the game where you don't know exactly where your standings are versus the other players, and you may not even know if you happen to be winning the game. Throughout the game, players are going to perform various things that are going to give them broken Elder Signs, and every one of these Elder Signs is worth a value anywhere from 1, 2, to 3 victory points at the end of the game. The trick is every time you get one of these Elder Signs, you don't show the other players the exact value of the Elder Signs that you've gained, and you don't move the Doom track until the end of the game unless you really, really want to, part of your strategy, and there are strategic reasons to do this. But as long as you have these Elder Signs placed face down on your faction board, you don't have to spend them, and at the end of the game, you get to actually turn these in for extra victory points, which could allow you still victory from another player sneakily at the end of the game. The base game comes with 36 of these broken Elder Signs, and the best way to do it is the game does come with one of these little nice bags where you can keep all these Elder Signs in, so you can draw your Elder Signs randomly and nobody knows exactly which numeric value you're getting. There's 36 of them. Most of them are worth 1 point, a few of them are worth 3 points, and half of them are worth about 2 points. The exact breakdown is 18, 12, and 6 if you really want to know what the breakdown is. And again, every time you're told to take an Elder Sign for performing any kind of action, simply draw one of the Elder Signs, look at its value. You're free to look at its value anytime you want, place it down on your board, and again, at the end of the game, after the Doom track has closed out, you're free to turn these over, flip them over, and get extra victory points, and again, possibly stealing victory from another player. And of course, don't forget that a player has to have all 6 of their spellbooks to win the game, so if you feel like this is a hopeless game, and there's no chance that you can win it, and you want to bring ruin down for everybody, and nobody has all 6 of their spellbooks, yes, you could definitely spend these broken Elder Signs, advance the track, end the game, and in this case, if nobody had all 6 of their spellbooks, every single player loses. It's mean, but hey, that's victory and that's defeat. After the Doom and Annihilation phase is over, and if nobody has actually reached one of the end game conditions and you haven't figured out if anybody's won the game, you move on to the action phase, and this is where the meat of the game occurs, where players take all their actions based on their current amount of power and based on special abilities that they may gain from their spellbooks. On a player's turn, there's 3 kinds of actions they can perform. They can perform a common action, they can perform a unique action, and they can perform an unlimited action. Now on your turn, you have to perform either a common action or a unique action. Unlimited actions are optional, but you can't perform an unlimited action unless you perform at least 1 common or 1 unique action. And additionally, just add a little bit to the confusion with the terminology the game uses, even though it's not too bad. The real only difference there is between a unique action and a common action is a unique action is just like a common action, except the difference is it's something only your faction has access to. Such as, for example, only the King and Yellow player has access to Desecration. It's a unique action, unique to their faction, but it's still a common action. It's just that only their faction has the ability to spread these Desecration tokens. No other faction can do that, at least not yet, unless they add that in some of the additional expansions that may come out in the future. Another example of a unique action is Cthulhu himself. If you have the correct spellbook in play, has the ability, if he's currently on a water space, he can actually submerge, which means he goes onto his faction board, and that any time later in the game, if the player wants to, he can be put back on the board in any single space that that player wants. Again, as long as you have that spellbook in play, that becomes a unique action for the Cthulhu or the green faction only to use, making that a unique action only for them. Now the way the action phase is going to work is every single player is going to get the chance to do 1 action and 1 action only, spending power to perform that action. Now if it ever comes back around to your turn and you currently have 0 power, you are out for the rest of the round. You cannot perform any more actions, even if you happen to have actions that use 0 power, and there are options and actions that require 0 power, but if you have 0 power left, you can't perform even those actions. because once you burn all your power, you're done doing any actions for the rest of the round. So spend your power very wisely. Even if you have a whole bunch of 0 power actions, you want to burn those while you still have at least 1 point of power, because again, once all your power is gone, you cannot do anything for the rest of the round, and you effectively can become a sitting duck for the other players to take advantage of. And again, I want to emphasize that on your turn, you're going to perform one action, no matter how much power it actually costs for you to do that action. And once you've done that one action, your turn is going to be over unless you have unlimited actions you also want to perform. And it's going to move to the next player in player order, and everybody's going to keep on going around, spending power, performing actions until everybody is completely out of power. Now the actions are in order. For the first action that you do, it's a common action, which means it's common to all the players, is you can bring a cultist onto the board. And the requirement for this is you have to have a cultist not currently on the board to bring back into play. So for example, the yellow player, since they have all 6 of their cultists in play at this time, can't actually do that action, but the green player, since they only have 2 cultists in play, or the red player, also only with 2 cultists in play, could perform that action. And to do so, you simply spend 1 power and bring a cultist into play in any area on the board where you currently have another unit. Now remember, a unit can be a great old one, a monster, or another cultist. So as long as you have 1 unit in that space, you can bring another cultist onto that location by spending 1 power, ending your turn unless you have an unlimited action you want to perform. Now the really important thing to remember about the bringing a cultist action into play, if you've been wiped out by another player during this round, if you still happen to have power, you can bring 1 cultist onto the board in any single space that you want, as long as you currently have nothing else on the board. If you have at least 1 thing on the board, that's the only place you can bring the additional cultist into play at. But again, if you have nothing on the board, you can bring your cultist into play, even in an area that has an enemy creature. Probably not a smart move to do, but you can bring 1 cultist back into play by spending 1 power and moving them anywhere on the board if you've been completely wiped out. One other quick point to make about cultists: a cultist has been captured by an enemy is not available for you to bring back into play. So if you happen to have a couple of your cultists captured by another player, that limits the amount of units you currently have access to. So be very careful about letting your opponent capture your cultists, because they're going to keep them on their faction board till the start of the power phase, where each one of these cultists is going to be sacrificed for 1 point of power, and that's at the time where they'll be returned to your supply to be able to use again. The next action you perform on your turn is if you happen to have a cultist in an area and control a gate, and it is mandatory that you control a gate, but if you happen to control a gate, you can spend power based on however much it costs to bring that monster into play, summon that monster onto that current location as long as you control a gate in that location. So if you don't control a gate, you cannot summon a monster. If you do control a gate, you can summon a monster to that location, paying the cost based on whatever it says on the board. For example, this creature costs exactly 2 power to bring into play. You can bring 1 monster into play on your turn as your action. And again, remember how I said some factions break those rules? Well, the red player has the ability to summon multiple monsters into play at one time for 1 action. It's unique to the red player only. Every other player can summon 1 monster into play, and then their turn is over, passes to the next player until it comes back to them again, where they get to perform 1 more action again. One important thing to understand though, special abilities such as Cthulhu's ability to devolve is actually not a recruit action, so you don't have to actually use a recruitment to use your devolve power. It's not considered a recruit action, it's considered a unique action, so don't get confused. The next action you can do is you can bring your Great Old One into play. Now every single one of these Great Old Ones have a different requirement, a different cost, and a different minimum thing that you must do to bring into play. Every one of them lists on the faction board exactly what you must do. If you can meet all those requirements, including power costs, you can bring your Great Old One into play in the location it states currently on your faction board. And again, it's different for each one of them, but that can be your 1 action for your turn. Do that action and pass to the next player, who also gets their next now perform an action. The next thing you can do on your turn is if you happen to have a cultist in a location where there currently is not a gate, and that's very, very important. There can never be more than 1 gate per location on the board, even if it happens to be a sea space, land space, or even North America, which happens to be a giant space. Does not matter. Each space can have only 1 gate. But if you happen to have a cultist in an area where there currently is not a gate, you can spend 3 power, bring the gate into play, put your cultist on top of that gate, and you now control that gate. as long as you can hold on to it, which means it's going to start giving you power during the power phase. The next thing you can do is the movement action, and the movement action is actually one of the most confusing things to explain in the game because it's one of the few times that you can semi-break the rules and actually technically do more than one action, even though it's really just the one action. You're spending multiple amounts of power to go ahead and power it. Now to do a move action, what you're going to do is you're going to spend one power for every single unit you want to move, and every unit can only move one space, so you can't spend 3 power to take one of your units to move them 3 spaces. Would not be allowed. You can only move each unit 1 space per power, but again, you can blow a lot of power to move all your units at once. So for example, the king and yellow player who currently has 8 units on the board could spend 8 power and move every one of these units 1 space, as long as they only move 1 space away. It doesn't matter where they go, as long as they each move no more than 1 space apiece. Or you can spend less than that, spend only 2 power, move 2 guys, whatever you want to do. As long as you have the power to power it, every one of your units can move up to 1 space. The only caveat to that is, again, like I said, every one of these factions likes to break the rules. The blue player, when they spend 1 power, is actually allowed to move 2 spaces because all their guys, even their cultists, have the ability to fly. And if you ever forget, that's actually listed on top of their faction board right here as the unique ability for the Crawling Chaos faction. The next thing you can do is you can capture a cultist, and now to capture a cultist, very important to understand this is not actually a battle action, so don't confuse capturing a cultist with an actual battle action. Now remember that hierarchy I told you about? A great old one is greater than a monster, which is greater than a cultist. Well, the way that works is one of your monsters can capture a cultist as long as that player does not have a creature of a matching hierarchy to block you from doing this. Now exactly how does that work, and I'll show you. To capture a cultist, an enemy cultist, you can't capture your own, so don't get confused or try to be sneaky with the rules or anything like that. But to capture a cultist, you just happen to have somebody who's on the hierarchy chain to capture that cultist, and it costs you 1 power to do that. So for this deep one, to capture this cultist, I just announced that my deep one is capturing this cultist and add it to my faction board so I can go ahead and sacrifice him at the beginning of the power phase to gain power from capturing this cultist. Now the only way for the yellow player to protect their cultist from being captured is to also have a monster on the same space, which basically protects them. So this means that yellow player cannot capture this green cultist, and this also means this green player cannot capture this yellow cultist because this monster protects this monster protects this cultist. And it doesn't matter what kind of monster it is, even though green has multiple kinds of monsters, they're all considered monsters, and just this one monster right here will protect their own cultists even from all 3 of these big bad monsters. Now the trick to this is, remember the hierarchy though, because a great old one is more powerful than a monster, so this great old one, even though there's all these monsters here to protect this cultist, the great old one is more powerful than all these monsters combined for a capture action only. So this great old one can capture this cultist, which can be sacrificed at a later date to gain power. Now how do you protect your cultists from the great old ones? Well, simple. Remember the hierarchy. If your great old one happens to be in that space, he's also going to protect your cultist, and that means that this player can't capture this cultist because this great old one protects him from this great old one. So in this standoff situation that we happen to have here, if Haster leaves this space, this cultist is going to be captured if that player chooses to do so. If Cthulhu leaves that space, that means this cultist is going to be captured if Haster decides to do so. Watch your cultist backs. Remember, they are your source of power. One important point to remember here, though, is that enemy factions don't protect your cultists. So even though red happens to be in the space, he's not going to stop yellow from taking this green cultist because the red player, the black goat, doesn't care about these green Cthulhu cultists and actually technically hopes they all get captured so they can get devoured and sacrificed during the power phase. Remember, only your great old one or only your monsters will protect your cultists. The final common action that we have is battle, which gives the name of the game Cthulhu Wars its name because this is a war, and you can't have a war with a lot of battles and a lot of people getting hurt because that's what makes the game fun. To announce a battle, all you have to do is have one of your units with at least 1 attack strength in the same space as an enemy faction, and that does mean that if there happens to be multiple factions in the same space, you have to actively choose which one of the factions you're attacking. So if it's a green player's turn and they want to announce a battle, they either need to attack the yellow player or they need to attack the red player. They can't attack both. They need to make a decision. Then once they made a decision, as long as they have at least one attack, strength, and power, which we do since we have our two monsters and our Cthulhu, versus Hastur, this cultist, and this cultist right here, everybody needs to figure out exactly how much total power and combat strength they have, and then we need to start rolling some dice. Every battle is broken down into 3 phases. There's the pre-battle phase, the battle phase, and then the post-battle phase, and during every one of those phases, the attacker makes all their decisions on what they want to do. Then their defender gets to decide if they want to use any powers in that phase. Then you move on to the next phase, and then finally the final post-battle phase. So a really good example of this is Cthulhu. If Cthulhu happens to be the attacker, if he wants to, before he even does any attacking, he can use his special ability of Devour, which allows him to just remove a unit from the enemy's forces and remove them from the battle during the pre-battle phase before the fight even starts. Since he is the attacker, he'd get to be able to do that first, but if he was the defender, that would mean that Hastur, as the attacker, gets to use any of his pre-battle abilities first, and if he, for some reason, has something that could stop Cthulhu from doing the Devour, he could do so, since as the attacker, he gets to do his pre-battle before Cthulhu would. Pre-battle, attacker does first. Battle, attacker does their actions first. Post-battle, the attacker resolves all their actions first. So let's go ahead and carry out a battle between Cthulhu and Hastur here, and we'll assume that Cthulhu is the aggressor or the attacker. We'll go ahead and go through all the actions and figure out exactly what each of our factions are going to do. So for the pre-battle phase, only Cthulhu has a special ability in this example, and he has the ability to use his Devour ability. And what that allows him to do is he needs to look at his opponent and say, I'm devouring one of your units. You need to pick which one of your units has just been devoured. So the yellow player gets to decide which one of their units just got devoured. Obviously, they're not going to have their Hastur devoured. They're going to have one of their cultists devoured, and a devoured cultist is removed and considered dead as a casualty of this battle. Then at this point, Hastur would get a chance as a defender to pick up pre-battle ability if they have one available. This example they don't, so now we're going to move on to the battle phase. And for the battle phase, what we need to do is we need to add up all the amount of dice that we get based on our creatures who are currently in the battle. So Cthulhu has a power of 6. We figured out by looking at his board. He has 6 attack dice. So there's 6 dice for having Cthulhu in play. Our Shoggoth, also in the battle, is going to give us an extra 2 dice to lead into this battle. Our Starspawn is going to give us an additional 3 dice in this battle. And this Deep One, who is also in this territory also, is going to give us 1 more attack die. These are going to be all the attack die we get to use as the attacker versus the Hastur player. And now we need to figure out how many dice Hastur gets. And if we need to figure out, we can look right here. And it's going to tell you that Hastur has amount of attack dice based on the current level of the ritual track, and let's say it happens to be at level 7 right now. That means the Hastur player gets to roll 3 combat dice. Since he only has 1 cultist also in this battle who doesn't have any attack power at all, it's going to be 7 attack dice versus the 12 attack dice of the Cthulhu player. Everybody needs to roll dice and start looking for results. The attacker is going to roll their dice first, and then the defender gets to roll their dice. And we're basically looking for anything that's a 4, 5, or a 6. And we want to separate those in different piles. Anything that's a 1, 2, or 3 is pretty much wasted unless we have a special ability that's going to change that. And in this instance, we don't. So, for example, Cthulhu got 4 that are a 4 or a 5, and 1 that happens to be a 6. Any 4 or 5 is going to be a wounded, or as the game calls it, pained. Because these big, gigantic creatures really don't get wounded. They kind of get pained, which means they're annoyed. And any roll of a 6 is going to be considered an instant kill. So the Hastur player has a couple 2s and 3s we'll remove. And we have 2 4s. And we also happen to have 2 6s. Now we need to resolve these combat effects. The important thing to understand here about combat is that all combat happens at the same time. So everybody rolls their dice. Then once all the dice are rolled, you're going to figure out the results. And again, starting with the attacker. And then the defender gets to resolve the results, starting with kills, and then followed with pain results. And each player, when they're attacked, gets to decide how the results are applied against their faction. So in this example, since Cthulhu happens to be the attacker, they're going to resolve all their kill results first. Now a 6 is always a kill, a 4 or 5 is a pain result, a 1, 2, or 3 means absolutely nothing and is a wasted roll in the combat. So since the Cthulhu player got 1 measly kill out of all 12 dice they rolled, Hastur gets to pick one of their units in the battle that they're going to go ahead and kill. Well, it's pretty obvious we're going to go ahead and take the cultist as the kill, and that's going to be removed from the board. Now the Hastur player gets to place their kill results against the Cthulhu player, Now the Haster rolled 2 kills and 2 wounded, so now the Cthulhu player needs to pick 2 of their units of the 4 currently involved in this battle, and we need to kill at least 2 of those units, but we get to decide which 2 are going to be killed. We're going to take the deep one and kill it, and then we're going to go ahead and kill the star spawn, removing them from the board. Now we got to go back to the attacker again and apply our pain results, because we happen to have 4 pain results. Now it's a little bit of overkill. We didn't need that many. All we need is just 1, since the yellow player only has 1 unit left in the fight. The yellow player gets to retreat, and they need to pick a location that's adjacent to the current area and does not contain a unit from the opposing player that they just fought. So that means since green has a unit in this location, yellow cannot retreat to that location because green has a unit there, but yellow could retreat here. They could retreat here. They could also retreat here. Even though there's a red player there, it doesn't matter. That's not the faction they just fought. They can also retreat back to this area where they have their own faction left over. It doesn't matter. The only place they are not legally allowed to retreat to is this spot, which is currently controlled by green, who they just fought. They would go ahead and move out of the area. Then the Cthulhu player, as the defender, needs to take 2 pain results. Since we only have 2 units left in the fight, we need to retreat 2 units. And again, we get to decide, but we can't retreat to an area that's controlled or contains units of the color we just fought. So we cannot retreat to here or here, but this area is perfectly legal, and this area is also perfectly legal to retreat to. Post-battle abilities will also come into play at this point, and also don't forget that even though the blue player, all their units have the ability to fly, retreating is not a fly action, so when the blue player retreats, they're only allowed to retreat to a neighboring location. They can't retreat 2 spaces away using their fly power. They can only fly when they're doing a move action, not a retreat action. Very, very important difference. Now I say the battle description for last because the battle is the most interesting thing, for the simple fact that normally battling is a common action, but if your faction has managed to get all 6 of your spellbooks into play, combat or battles now become an unlimited action for you, which means now at this point you could technically move and then combat all in the same action, because combat is not a common action anymore. It's basically a free action you do along with another action on your turn, which means that getting all 6 of your spellbooks makes you a very powerful combat monster, literally. So it's also a target for you to try to get all 6 of your spellbooks as quick as you can, making combat from an actual action where you use up your action for the round to an unlimited action where you can actually start moving and attacking. So again, on your turn, you're basically going to take a common action, you're going to take an unlimited action, or you're going to take a unique action. The trick is you can only do 1 common or unique action. You can do as many unlimited actions as you want. And again, combat becomes, or battle becomes an unlimited action once you've got all 6 of your spellbooks. But until then, you can only move as your action, wait for your turn to come back around again, and then announce a battle if you happen to be in a space with one of your enemy factions. The action phase is going to continue like that, with every player picking an action to perform and doing that action and spending the power as long as they can continue to power it. Power's a very limited resource, so remember that once all your power is gone, you can't do any more actions on your turn. Even if you want to do an action that doesn't cost any power at all, including unlimited actions, so make sure you plan exactly how you burn your power, again, so you don't leave yourself as a sitting duck on your turn. It's not smart to start a turn with 10 power, blow all 10 of that power to bring your great old one into play in a legal manner, burn all your power, leave you with 0, leave you as a sitting duck for all your opponents to come in there and try to destroy you, meaning you just wasted all that power and you're out for this entire round as you watch your units slowly get destroyed, slowly removed from the board because you made a very, very terrible decision and now you're way behind the curveball. That's basically the complete rules for Cthulhu Wars. Remember, you start each round by gathering power, by having cultists on the board, by controlling gates, by having open gates on the board that aren't controlled by anybody, by sacrificing cultists that you managed to capture from your opponent. They can be sacrificed for power. You're going to decide who the first player is. You're going to go ahead and do the Doom track, possibly do some annihilation, figure out if anybody's won, move on to the action phase, and keep on doing that until you find out who is the winner of Cthulhu Wars. I hope I've given you a good overview of how to play Cthulhu Wars. I didn't want to get into the unique actions because they did a fantastic job when they designed this game. All the unique actions are very well explained on each one of these spellbooks, and the spellbooks and each faction power are basically the only unique abilities you get for your Great Old One. For any special powers you may have for your units, they're all very well described on your spellbooks and very well described on your faction board. So it'd be a waste of time for me to spend 20 minutes to sit here and describe every one of these unique actions, since they're very well explained on the board, including the desecration rules and how that gives you even more power when that time comes. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to go ahead and clean everything up and start video number 2, where I show you a game of Cthulhu Wars. I'm going to play a 4-player game. I'm going to intentionally play some of these factions very smart, intentionally play some of these factions not so smart, so you can see the difference and see how this is a very deep, very strategic, tactical game.